Hey everybody, welcome to this tutorial where we're going to be walking through how you can add users to your site, update users, and then remove users. As you can see up here, I am on Tableau Online. So if you're on Tableau Server, some of this will look a little bit different for you in terms of the options that you have available. And we'll take a good look at that here once we get into the actual code. So all of the examples that we're about to lay out are based 100% on what's available to us through Tableau Server's REST API reference. And you'll notice a lot of familiar naming in the methods that we call on using the tableau-api-lib library. Those names are going to look very familiar to the names seen here in the REST API reference. And that's no accident. The Tableau API-lib library is actually designed to try to mirror the naming that you see here in the documentation as closely as possible. So when we add a user to the site, we're going to be using the add user to site endpoint, and that's going to translate into the add user to site method in the Tableau API-lib library. Similar story here for update user and for remove user from site down at the bottom. So let's hop in, take a look at some code. All of this up here at the top, I'm going to skip over explaining this because this is covered in the Getting Started tutorial, and that's going to be linked in the description of this video. So feel free to check that out if you want to know why I'm exposing my personal access token and all of this stuff to you. So we have established our connection to Tableau Server by running this line here, and I can sign in. By the way, these response codes, if you ever are confused whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, just go check out the REST API reference and it'll tell you exactly the response codes that you can expect to see if you have a successful call or a problematic issue arises. So now that we have a connection to Tableau Server, or sorry, Tableau Online, we can go ahead and run this querying function that's get users data frame. And the querying section of the Tableau API library is all about packaging the data that you retrieve from the REST API and putting it into Pandas DataFrames so that you can more easily manipulate the data and then do other things with it, as we'll see in this tutorial. And right now, once again, I'm just lonely out here. It's just me. So let's change that. Let's add a user to the site so I have somebody to hang out with. And I do have some user information stored in a CSV file. So we can see I have two users described in this CSV file. Casey Jones is one of them. So let's pick on Casey out here. So first I'm going to go through manually adding a user, and then at the end of the tutorial, or for the second part of it, we'll look at how you could add in bulk users from a CSV. Maybe you have 1,000 users that you're trying to add and you're not wanting to sit around all day manually entering in that user's name and the user's email. If you had to do that, why is it even better to use the REST API versus plugging that in manually on the site? So we'll show you how you could really speed through and manage those users, either updating users, removing them, adding them. You could do all of that if you have the users that you want to add, update, or remove in a CSV file. So let's take a look at this manual process. I'm going to be setting this response equal to this con.addUser to site. So as I mentioned before, add user to site was how the Tableau Server REST API reference named this endpoint. So the method implemented in this library just mirrors that. And all we need to do is try to pass in some user information. And let's see how this goes for us. Looks like this didn't work out too well, and this is just a little trap I set because on Tableau Online, your username has to be an email address. So if we take a look out here at the REST API reference, you can get more information than you'd ever really want to know, probably. And so even if you're on Tableau Server and you have a lot more options to you, this is really good to read through because it's going to tell you how you might want to set up your usernames if you're using Active Directory versus local authentication. And in this case, I'm on Tableau Online, so it's really important for me to know that the username needs to be an email address. All right, so coming back into the code, let's fix the errors of our ways and set this username to casey.jones@devix.io, one of our best employees. And site role is going to be viewer. Sorry, Casey. You can look, but you can't touch. And let's see what happens here. We get the response code 201, and we can see that that means we've actually created that user. So when you create a user through the REST API, you are going to get this really crucial piece of information returned to you, and that is the user's ID. And so we'll see how this could come into play. A lot of times, if you're, let's say, looping through a CSV and creating users, you might want to store those user IDs so that you could then loop back through, and for each one of those new users you created, you could update them and add email addresses, maybe modify their full names. So it's a really good thing to know about, that does get returned to you when you create the user. So now that we have that user created, let's just verify that they are available on the site. So I queried the get users data frame function, and I can verify this way. We could also come out here to my Tableau Online site and refresh this. And indeed, we can see there is a new viewer on the site, and that is Casey Jones. Here we can also see the name that I can't actually modify because this is Tableau Online. So the only thing I could really change about this user is going to be the site role, or removing them from the site altogether. And we'll see how we can do that. So when we want to update the user, I just need to get the user ID, which in this case I'm grabbing from the JSON response from when I created that user. And let's try this. Let's try to update the user's email address, the user's full name, and even though I put in an incorrect email address here, let's just see how this goes for us. And we can see that this is forbidden, just like how when you're creating a user on Tableau Online, you have to follow certain conditions in order for it to be successful. When you're updating a user, you run into these limitations as well. So on Tableau Server, you could update a lot more than what you can on Tableau Online. But you could almost think of it as when you're on Tableau Online, you're almost like a single site that's a part of a massive Tableau server that Tableau, the company, manages. So you don't have all the privileges that you would have if you owned your own Tableau server and you were a Tableau server administrator that controlled all the keys, could open all the doors. So we have to play by the rules. And if we look at our options when we're updating a user, we can see here in the documentation that for Tableau Online, you can update the site role, but you can't update or change a user's password, username, which is their email address, or their full name. So with that in mind, let's update the user by only passing in a new site role. And when we do this, everything comes out great. The new site role is Explorer, and previously Casey was a viewer. So if we go out to site users, we can see they were a viewer, and as we refresh this, they are now an Explorer. All right, so that worked, and we could once again verify that everything worked by running our querying function here. It just fetches all the users on our site. And now that we have added a user to the site and we've updated the user, let's see how we could remove a user. And really all you need to do is use this remove user from site method and pass in the user ID. In this case, if I want to remove the user that I just added, I had stored their ID in a variable called new user ID. So I'm just going to pass that into this method, and we'll see that I get a 204 response code. And if you went out to the REST API reference and looked up the remove user from site endpoint, you would see that this means we successfully removed the user. All right, so that kind of wraps up the basics, the kind of core components of actually using the endpoints for adding a user, updating a user, and removing a user. And now we'll just move into this slightly more advanced application of all three of those endpoints where we can in bulk add users and in bulk update users and in bulk remove users from the site. So without explaining too much about Python functions, here I just really want to focus on the REST API. Maybe in future tutorials we'll dive into some of this if you're not as familiar with Python itself. But just the kind of the need to know things that are happening here is that I've defined a function. The function accepts certain arguments. In this case, my Tableau server connection, a file path pointing to a CSV that has my user details in it. And in this case, I also am just using a delimiter for my CSV file that I've defined. And so all that information is going to be passed to this function, and the logic of the function rests inside of this function definition so that out in my code, I could just call on this add users to site function, and it's going to say, okay, give me the connection, give me the users in that CSV file, and then it's going to do all of this heavy lifting for me. Now what this is actually doing is it's fetching a data frame, Pandas DataFrame, from that CSV file that I specified, and then I'm going to be populating this list that I've named responses with each response as we go through each row of the CSV file and add a user to the site. The response we get from the server after adding that user is going to get appended into this list, and that's what's going to get returned to us at the end. And what this is doing here, this is the process of looping over the data frame. So this is part of the reason why Pandas is so valuable and such a great tool to be using when you're working with this data, is it's going to allow us to use the iteros method on the data frame, and that's going to say, all right, for as many rows that exist in that CSV, we're going to go through each one, and for each row, we're going to be calling the add user to site endpoint, or the add user to site method, and we're going to pass in as the username whatever the username in that row was, and then whatever the site role in that role was as the site role for that user. Okay, so after that long-winded explanation, we can just see that this is successful for us. We end up creating 2 new users on our site, and if I come up to my Tableau Online site and I refresh this, we'll see that I have 2 users here. One is an explorer who can publish, one is a viewer. All right. Here I'm just printing out the responses of creating those 2 users, and we can see that I get those 2 user detail, or the details for both of those users as JSON. So I could actually create a data frame, as I do here, that's filled with my new user information. And I'm going to do that so that I can then loop over my new users and use their IDs that were just provided to me from the server to update these users. So I'm going to, in this case, bad news for these users, I'm going to unlicense them. So I've made a function here, much like with the add users to site function that I built above. This is going to do the exact same process, but instead of adding users, I'm going to be unlicensing users. So I have every user that I just added, I'm just making this, all these users are the ones I'm going to unlicense. So I'm just unlicensing these 2, and I'm going to loop over each one and update them and set their site role to be unlicensed. So let's do that. And we can see that in the response I get from the server, both those users are unlicensed. And once again, to prove the point, let's come out here to Tableau Online, and we can see that indeed these users both have the site role unlicensed now. All right, moving right along. Now that we've unlicensed those users, let's go ahead and remove anybody who's unlicensed. So down here, I've created another function called remove unlicensed users. And this is just going to query every user on my site. That's what this first line here does. And then it's going to say, let's make a copy of that data frame and call it unlicensed users df. And this is going to be any user inside of the user's data frame whose site role is equal to unlicensed. Now that I have the unlicensed users, I'm going to loop through each one of them, and I'm going to say, let's call the remove user from site method and pass in whatever that user's ID is. And then we're going to append the response from removing that user to this responses list, and finally return that list. Just as we did before for adding users and updating users, now we're seeing what that looks like for removing the users. And we can see that my two responses indicate that those users were removed. And in fact, if we check on Tableau Online one final time, I'm back to being lonely up here all by myself, no users around me. And so I guess that's a good opportunity to say thanks for watching this video, and hope that you'll join us in future videos. And also, if you are interested in having a Tableau Online site, like what I'm playing around with here as my sandbox environment, check out the Tableau Developer Program. If you sign up and you're accepted in there, you get a free site for playing around with, just like I'm doing here. And there's also a good community out there. Lots of people are asking questions and getting their questions answered. So we hope to see you out there and hope to see you in future videos. Thanks for tuning in.